The whole narrative about Russia has infinite manpower, you kill 1 million Russians, they'll send 2 million more, that sort of thing. That's a myth. Russia can afford to have, a slave army when you don't pay them anything to go fight and die. But when you're paying them that premium, that becomes a hard thing to sustain, especially as the war protracts longer and longer.
So there were a flurry of articles when Russian casualties reached 500,000, and there will likely be another flurry of articles when they hit 1 million. Is this actually a significant number, or is it more of a symbolic thing?
I would assess it to be more of a symbolic thing. I mean, Russian casualties are astronomically high. The attrition rate is not in Russia's favor at this time. And, our feeble human brains, we like round numbers. We like big numbers like 1 million or 500,000. They help us get a sense of the scale. But I would say that in terms of the actual combat, it's not a particularly significant number. What's more significant is thinking about where is Russia going to get the next million from or the next 500,000 from. Russian force generation is a key limiting factor for Russia's ability to continue prosecuting the war. And Russia's force generation apparatus has a lot of challenges that'll be facing it in the next, I would argue, 6 to 18 months.
Could you just take us through some of those challenges that you mentioned?
Absolutely. So, look, Vladimir Putin made a fundamental strategic mistake in deciding how to resource this war. What Vladimir Putin has done is he has created a system in which he doesn't use the monopoly of violence of the Russian state to coerce Russians to go fight and die in Ukraine, as the Soviet Union might have. What Putin has done is he's created a alternative social contract where he pays you to go fight in Ukraine. The Russians amended their laws on military service, and they created a new class of servicemen called volunteers. And part of the social contract is we pay you large one-time sign-up bonuses. We pay you very high salaries. We pay you if you're killed or wounded. And that strategy can work if you're planning on running a short war. It does not work if you are running a multi-year protracted war. I mean, the current high rate is, I believe there's some oblasts in central Russia that are offering up to 35 to 40,000 US dollars, 3 million rubles plus, just for a one-time sign-up bonus. And what we know from Russian casualty rates and their recruitment rates, they lose and recruit roughly somewhere in the ballpark of 35 to 45,000 people per month. Perhaps they recruit a little bit north of that number. At $40,000 a head just for the sign-up bonus, let alone salaries and let alone other benefits and remittances if you're killed or wounded, I mean, this is a very fast way to not have it be sustainable. Russia can afford to have, a slave army when you don't pay them anything to go fight and die. But when you're paying them that premium, that becomes a hard thing to sustain, especially as the war protracts longer and longer.
Obviously, Russia's economy is struggling under sanctions and other issues. So, in your sort of estimation, like how sustainable is this method of recruitment? Can we actually put a timeline on things?
This is supremely difficult to do. I guess the closest analog that I would point to is trying to predict the fall of the Soviet Union based off of the economic indicators. When it happened, it was dramatic and it was fast, and in the aftermath, it sort of seemed like it was inevitable. But in the late 1980s, leading up to it, I mean, the consensus was that the Soviet Union was basically stable. That despite problems, they were chugging along until it wasn't. If you look at the current Russian economic indicators, for example, their inflation rate, their overnight lending interest rates, Russian monetary constraints, these don't bode well for the Russian economy. I mean, the central bank just made the decision to reduce the inflation rate, or pardon me, the overnight lending rate from 21% to 20%. When, in my humble opinion, the central bank likely probably should be increasing the rate because inflation is still out of control in Russia. Real inflation in Russia, if you look at commodities, is somewhere closer to 20 to 25%. But that's largely because everyone in Russia is flush with these Ministry of Defense dollars. Government spending is out of control. It's a very, very, very loose fiscal policy, and so the economy is at risk of overheating. And I don't know to what extent the economy can continue to last. There's a tremendous amount of debt that Russian banks are taking on to finance all of this, but I suspect what will happen one day at the current rate is a Russian bank will have to default on its debt, and that will trigger some sort of financial meltdown. I can't name the time or the hour or the place, but at the current recruitment rates and the numbers of people that are being recruited and what we know about their compensation packages, it seems very much like the Vladimir Putin of today is cashing, or rather writing checks that the Vladimir Putin a year or 2 years from now will not be able to cash.
You mentioned there a scenario of a Russian bank defaulting. For people who are obviously keeping a close eye on this, are there any other indicators that people should be keeping a lookout for?
Key things will be, the international sanctions regimes. It's very important that we continue to isolate Russia and prevent them from having access to international capital, because if the Russians do get access to international capital, then that will serve as a buffer and a cushion that will allow the Russians to be able to finagle their economic policy to evade such a scenario. But so long as we deprive them of the access to international capital, and so long as we keep the Russian attrition rate in Ukraine high, then we can keep the Russians on course for having to grapple with some of these problems. One of the mistakes that I think we can make here in the West is thinking that we can bring about our desired outcome vis-a-vis Russia with just economic tools by itself. I mean, sanctions are attractive, economic tools are attractive because they don't cost us a whole lot of resources and they're relatively simple to implement. However, we have to keep reminding ourselves that the key driver, the engine of Russia's economic woes, is in fact its casualty rate and its losses on the battlefield in Ukraine. That is what is driving the need to recruit and replace 45,000 soldiers a month. That is what is destroying all the main battle tanks. That is what is actively destroying the Russians. And the minute that the Ukrainians become less lethal, the minute that the Ukrainians do not impose those heavy losses on the Russia at the same scale, then the economic picture becomes much better for the Russians. So the maximum pressure campaign necessitates not only economic instruments, but as a bare minimum, maintaining Ukraine's lethality.
And so you've mentioned sanctions there and the importance of keeping them up. There's been reports just in the last couple of days that Donald Trump is looking to weaken the Russian sanctions that the US might place on Russia. So is there a very real possibility that Donald Trump could enable Putin to continue waging this war for far longer than would be necessary?
There's always a risk. I don't know where the administration's head is at. I mean, you can go back 2 weeks ago, he was promising to consider sanctioning Russia under the current sanctions bill that's in the U.S. Senate that has over 80 co-sponsors. He says other things. I regard his public statements as being, north one way one day and south the other. So I really don't know. But yes, there is always that risk. The truth of the matter is that the center of gravity for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's not the tactics of how many hundreds of meters did Russian soldiers manage to seize at the cost of hundreds of casualties, or thousands of casualties. The real question is, will the international coalition supporting Ukraine continue to do so? Because the collective resources and potential of the international coalition supporting Ukraine dwarfs those of the Russians. And the key parable of this war to this point has been the international coalition's inability to push back against the Russians. The accommodation of the Russians, doing too little too late, has resulted with Ukraine and the United States and our allies foregoing opportunities to defeat the Russians in Ukraine.
Now, we're just talking about economic factors here, but do you see any potential scenarios where maybe something in the Russian domestic scene also leads to pressure on Putin to end the war? Or do you think the Russian population is quite blasé almost about these mounting casualty figures?
So I think the Russian population is pretty blasé about it. I mean, this is the deal, right? That's why there's a whole bunch of blood money attached to your voluntary sign up to go fight in Ukraine. Because if you're killed or you're wounded, well, you took the money, so you're not going to protest. You're not going to have an issue with it. It's sort of, that's the cost benefit analysis. Politically, it's genius. I mean, because for Putin, he avoids the issue what happened with the Afghan war, which was people who were coerced into the Soviet military and didn't really have a choice being sent to a war to go die in droves, whereas this is completely voluntary. And so it's politically genius. It's economically stupid, however, because if you have to keep giving that premium, it's just not sustainable over the long run. Now, the other thing that I'll point out is there are competing factions within Russia domestically beyond just the general population from whom the Kremlin takes recruits. Russian financial institutions, Russian banks, the banking class, the capitalist class, Russian manufacturers, they're upset with the fact that the Russian interest rate was as high as it was. I mean, the fact that the Russians actually just recently reduced the interest rate from 21% to 20% was a concession in part to weapons manufacturers, bankers, financiers, because it's very difficult to do business when the cost of borrowing money and lending money is that high. And they've been complaining that it's bad for business, it's bad for the bottom line. To a certain extent, it's also bad for Russia's own force reconstitution because it's difficult to be able to run the military factories and build out your capital when the lending and borrowing rate's that high. Now, this is a place here where the Kremlin is making some, I would say, monetarily questionable policy decisions and lowering the interest rate in the interest of political interest, both the political interest of continuing to prosecute the war when really it's not monetarily sound to do so, at least with this financing and strategy, and political concessions to those bankers and financiers and et cetera who have been, are yearning for the good old days of a lower interest rate. There's some wedges here I think that we can drive. I'm not going to say that it's going to end the war, but a lot of people I think just don't pay close attention to how there are vulnerabilities, there are unexploited vulnerabilities within the Russian system that we don't really think about. How do we leverage that?
And what would be some options for leveraging that? I mean, you're talking there about the sort of the business elite in Russia. Like, what would be some ways that the West could apply pressure to sort of provoke them into perhaps taking some form of action or doing something a bit stronger than what they're doing now?
Well, I don't think we can actually force them to do anything that's stronger. The Kremlin and the power vertical is so strong, and I think most of the business elite, the former late Yevgeny Prigozhin notwithstanding, are not going to do anything because they're going to be made examples of. They're going to get Prigozhin or they're going to get Khodorkovsky, like with Yukos back in the day. But that said, that we can create some frictions, and at a minimum, we should prevent these guys from getting their assets back. There's the frozen assets that are sitting in largely Western European and Belgian financial institutions. I think it would be a tremendous fool's errand to give that back to the Russians, because as far as I see it, it's either we give it back to the Russians and they get it for free, and then in the future, moving forward, no Russians will ever do business with Western financial institutions so that they can never be held hostage like this again, or we seize the assets anyway, and also the Russians don't come back to the Western financial institutions anyway. So these are not going to be return customers in any event, and we don't want their money in any event. And I think you can actually make a principled legal case for the seizure of not just the revenue from the interest, but the principal.
Now, the second 500,000 losses that Russia suffered has occurred just in little over the last year. Like, what can we say about what all of those deaths and injuries have actually achieved on the battlefield?
So, look, over the grand scheme of the last 3.5 odd years of war, the Russians have managed to seize about 18.5, maybe 19% of Ukraine's territory. And that's not new, all of it. I mean, 7% of that was already occupied as of 2014. So they've managed to eke out an additional 12% of Ukraine's territory. They've not seized any strategic capital cities, oblast capital cities. They have seized only a handful of operationally significant cities like Avdiivka and Vuhledar and a few other small ones in Donetsk. But for the most part, what we see the Russians doing are impaling themselves on the sharp tip of Ukrainians' defensive spear, and they are making tactical gains. They are seizing small villages, they are seizing fields, and it's painful to seize territory. But, the Russians' main offensive operation for last year in 2024 was to get to Pokrovsk and seize Pokrovsk. And so when you look at on the map, you break out the calipers and you draw the distance between where the Russians started near Avdiivka and having seized Avdiivka in the late winter and then getting to the outskirts of Pokrovsk, they advanced about 55 kilometers, maybe 60 kilometers, if I'm being generous. And they did that at the expense of losing well over 5 or 6 armored divisions worth of equipment. I mean, these are hundreds of armored personnel carriers, hundreds of tanks, hundreds of thousands of casualties. And, if you look at the great battles of World War II and what you could expect six divisions to do in terms of maneuver warfare on the same terrain, I mean, they would be making orders of magnitude much faster gains. I mean, look at the Battle of Stalingrad and how long it took for the Soviet army to get from Stalingrad to Berlin in a matter of months. I mean, it's a snail's pace, and the costs are just not worth it. And so I would argue and say, look, given the extreme attrition rates that the Russians are facing, and given that Putin has handcuffed himself to a economically bankrupt strategy of how to finance and resource the war, the Russians have kind of put themselves into a vice of their own making. And I would argue that we can probably extract either battlefield concessions, diplomatic concessions, or other concessions from the Russians, as long as we continue to bleed them and keep them in this vice. The whole narrative about Russia has infinite manpower, you kill 1 million Russians, they'll send 2 million more, that sort of thing. That's a myth, but it also assumes a couple of things, and that assumes that you're going to send, slave soldiers to go die for nothing the way that the Tsars or the Soviet Union did. But Putin doesn't do that. He pays you $35,000 or $45,000 for a one-time sign-up. And that's just not how this works.
Thanks for watching, and if you'd like to see more great interviews like that, you can support our work by becoming a member, and you can do that at kyivindependent.com/membership.